They say a man named Solomon could see death coming, not in dreams or visions, but in the way a person breathed, in how their skin looked under lamplight, in the rhythm of their pulse, when he pressed his fingers to their wrist and smiled. The summer of 1,851 inches. Mobile, Alabama brought heat so thick it felt like drowning on dry land, and with it came a revelation that would make every wealthy family in the city question whether the people serving their meals, washing their clothes, and sleeping in their quarters were planning their murders. This isn't a ghost story. What happened in Mobile between 1847 and 1851 was far more disturbing than anything supernatural could ever be, because it was entirely, terrifyingly human. July 28th, 1851. The courtyard behind Mobile's courthouse filled before dawn with people who wanted to watch a man hang. Not just any man. Solomon. No last name recorded in the documents, just Solomon, as if one word was enough to capture someone who'd outsmarted an entire city for 4 years. The gallows stood in the center of the yard, fresh-cut wood that still smelled like pine, and the crowd pressed close enough that you could feel the collective breath of 300 people waiting for death. But here's what makes that morning impossible to forget. As Solomon climbed the 13 steps to the platform, his hands bound behind his back, he turned to face the crowd and did something no one expected. He smiled. Not the broken smile of a man accepting his fate, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like satisfaction. The prosecutor who'd secured Solomon's conviction stood near the front, a man named Wallace Breenidge, who'd built his career on sending people to the gallows. He'd expected Solomon to beg, to plead for mercy, to offer some final confession that would tie everything together neatly. Instead, Solomon looked directly at him and spoke in a voice so steady it carried across the entire courtyard. "You want to know if I did it," he said. "If I really killed all those people you think I killed?" The crowd went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Solomon's eyes swept across the faces below him, landing on specific people in the crowd. Wealthy families who'd lost relatives under mysterious circumstances, doctors who'd signed death certificates, sheriffs who'd investigated and found nothing. "And I want you to spend the rest of your lives wondering," Solomon continued. "Because the not knowing, that's worse than anything I could tell you right now. That's what you deserve." The executioner pulled the hood over Solomon's head before he could say anything else, and 60 seconds later, the trap door opened. The crowd dispersed slowly afterward, murmuring to each other, unsettled in ways they couldn't quite name. They'd come to see justice done, to see a murderer punished, but instead they'd witnessed something that felt more like a final move in a game they hadn't realized they were playing. Because Solomon was right. The not knowing would haunt them. And to understand why, you need to go back 4 years, to when a man who could read medical texts arrived in Mobile and began studying the people who owned him with the focused attention of a scientist examining specimens under glass. Mobile in 1847 sat at the mouth of the Alabama River like a jewel someone had dropped in mud and tried to polish clean. The city had money. More money than most places in Alabama, built on cotton that flooded through its port on the way to mills in England and Massachusetts. The wealthy families lived in houses that made statements: Greek columns, imported marble, gardens designed by landscape architects from New Orleans. These families intersected constantly, their lives woven together through business deals, marriages, church attendance, and the quiet competition of people who measured their worth in property, human and otherwise. The Chamberlain family lived on Government Street, in a house with 8 bedrooms and a ballroom that could hold 60 people. Thomas Chamberlain owned timber mills and liked to tell anyone who'd listen that he'd turned $3,000 into a fortune through hard work and smart investments. What he didn't mention was that the hard work was done by 40 enslaved people who cut timber in conditions that killed 1 or 2 of them every year. 3 blocks away, the Whitfield family occupied a mansion that had cost more than some people would see in a lifetime. James Whitfield dealt in cotton futures, gambling on crop yields and market prices with money he'd inherited from his father. His wife, Amelia, spent her days managing a household staff of 12 and worrying about their 5 children, especially the youngest, Sarah, who'd been sick more often than she'd been well since birth. The Prescott family controlled warehouses on the waterfront, the kind of structures where fortunes could be made or lost in an afternoon, depending on whose shipment arrived first. Daniel Prescott was the kind of man who believed volume made him important, laughing too loud at his own jokes and treating everyone around him like props in his personal performance. His sister Catherine lived with him after her husband died, existing in that precarious position of dependent relative, grateful for charity, but reminded of her dependence with every meal. These families and a dozen others like them formed Mobile's aristocracy, and they shared something beyond wealth and social position. They shared access to a man named Solomon, though they didn't think of it that way. To them, Solomon was property that occasionally got loaned out between households. Need someone to deliver a message? Solomon can go. Need someone who knows medicine to sit with a sick relative? Solomon has that training. Need someone literate enough to help transcribe documents? Solomon reads and writes better than most. They trusted him because he'd been trained by a Quaker physician in Charleston, because he seemed intelligent and docile, because he'd never given them reason not to trust him. That trust was the weapon he'd been sharpening since the day he arrived. Solomon came to Mobile in the winter of 1843, purchased by Pierre Devereaux at an estate sale for $800. The bill of sale described him as 31 years old, 6 feet tall, no distinguishing marks, educated in medicine and carpentry, valuable for household management. What the bill of sale didn't mention was what had happened to Solomon's previous owners, a family in Charleston who'd suffered a series of unfortunate deaths that no one had connected until after the estate was being liquidated. 3 family members dead in 2 years. Heart failure, fever, accident, the kind of deaths that happen in any household, especially in a city where yellow fever and cholera could wipe out entire families in a summer. No one suspected anything. No one looked too closely. Solomon had learned an important lesson from that experience. People see what they expect to see, and they expect enslaved people to be simple, grateful, and harmless. Pierre Devereaux owned a house on Conti Street that required constant maintenance, and a wife, Marguerite, who required constant attention. Solomon became indispensable within 6 months. He could fix furniture, prepare remedies for headaches and stomach troubles, keep accounts, and move through the house like furniture himself, always present, but never intrusive. The other enslaved people in the household, 7 of them living in quarters behind the main house, recognized something different about Solomon from the start. He watched people, not the way someone watches a scene unfold, but the way a hunter watches prey, noting patterns, learning habits, identifying weaknesses. Marcus, who drove the carriage, mentioned it once to Rachel, who managed the kitchen. "That man sees too much," Marcus said. And Rachel had nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, but not wanting to put it into words, because words made things real, and real things could get you killed. Solomon spent his first year in Mobile doing nothing but observing. He volunteered for every errand that took him into other households. He offered to help when families needed someone with medical knowledge. He made himself useful in ways that expanded his access, his mobility, his understanding of how Mobile's wealthy families operated. And while he moved through their houses, he collected information the way some people collect coins, who drank too much and when, who had weak hearts or breathing problems, who fought with their spouses behind closed doors, who feared illness more than death itself, who treated their enslaved people with casual cruelty that would never appear in any public record. He learned where medicine cabinets were kept, which doors stayed unlocked, what food arrived from which suppliers, who tasted dishes before they reached the table and who didn't bother. And Solomon collected something else too, plants. Mobile's climate grew everything, and Solomon knew exactly what to look for. White snake root in the shaded areas near the river, the kind of plant that could make milk deadly if a cow ate it first. Oleander from the ornamental gardens that wealthy families planted for beauty, never thinking about how toxic every part of the plant could be. Pokeweed with roots that could cause convulsions. Aconite that grew wild in certain areas, beautiful and lethal. Foxglove that could stop a heart or make it race until it tore itself apart. He dried these plants in his quarters, ground them into powders, prepared tinctures, and stored them in jars under his bed, and when anyone asked what he was doing, he told them he was studying medicine so he could be more useful. They believed him, because why wouldn't they? A slave learning to heal was valuable. A slave learning to kill was unthinkable. By the spring of 1847, Solomon had spent 4 years preparing, and he was ready to begin what he thought of as his experiment. Not revenge, exactly. Revenge was emotional, reactive, something that happened in the moment. This was different. This was systematic, calculated. Solomon had identified targets based on specific criteria. Some were people who made the world measurably worse by existing in it. Others were people who'd created problems for him specifically, who'd seen too much or asked too many questions. A few were what he thought of as strategically necessary, people whose deaths would shift power dynamics or create opportunities. And he'd worked out methods for each one, approaches that would make their deaths seem natural, expected, even inevitable. The first death came on April 19th, 1847, and it seemed unremarkable at the time. Thomas Chamberlain collapsed in his study after dinner, face first onto his desk, papers scattering to the floor around him. His wife found him 20 minutes later when she came to ask about household expenses, and by the time the doctor arrived, Chamberlain was cold. Heart failure, the doctor pronounced after a cursory examination. The man was 53, overweight, fond of rich food and cigars. His heart had simply given out, the kind of thing that happened to men of a certain age and disposition. No one thought to question it. No one looked closer. And no one remembered that 3 days earlier, Solomon had been in the Chamberlain house delivering documents from Pierre Devereaux, and that Thomas Chamberlain had offered him a glass of brandy from his personal decanter, the one he kept in his study for afternoon indulgence. Solomon had accepted with appropriate gratitude, had poured the drink, and while Chamberlain was distracted with reading the documents, had added something extra to the decanter. Something extracted from foxglove that would sit dormant in alcohol, waiting. 3 drinks later, spread over 3 days, and Thomas Chamberlain's already strained heart had encountered a compound that made it work harder and harder until it simply stopped. The death looked natural because in a sense it was. The foxglove had just accelerated what would have happened eventually, compressed years of decline into 3 days of increasing strain that felt like nothing more than the usual discomfort of aging. When the doctor signed the death certificate, Solomon was back at the Devereaux house, grinding more plants in his quarters, preparing for the next one. But here's what made Solomon different from other killers, what made him dangerous in a way that still feels disturbing more than a century and a half later. He couldn't help himself. He had to tell someone. Not confess. Exactly. That would have been stupid, and Solomon was anything but stupid. Instead, he predicted. 2 days before Thomas Chamberlain died, Solomon had been in the servants' area of the Chamberlain house, waiting to be given documents to carry back. The cook, a woman named Mary, had been preparing dinner, and they'd talked the way people do when they're both working. Solomon had mentioned casually, almost as if commenting on the weather, that Mr. Chamberlain didn't look well. His heart's working too hard, Solomon had said. You can see it in how his neck pulses, how his fingers stay swollen even in the morning. I'd say 3 days, maybe 4, before it gives out entirely. Mary had laughed, uncomfortable but not really worried. You can't know something like that. Solomon had just looked at her with those steady eyes that never seemed to blink quite enough. I know bodies, he'd said simply. I know what they look like when they're failing. And when Thomas Chamberlain died exactly 3 days later, Mary had felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd mentioned the conversation to her mistress, Abigail Chamberlain, who dismissed it as unfortunate coincidence. The man had been unwell, anyone could have seen it. But Mary remembered, and she'd remember again when the predictions continued, when they kept coming true with the kind of accuracy that shouldn't have been possible. The second death came 6 weeks later, and this one couldn't be dismissed as an old man's heart giving out. Catherine Prescott was 38 years old, thin as a rail because her brother Daniel rarely allowed her enough food to feel satisfied, and she'd learned to make herself small in every possible way. She took ill on a Tuesday in early June, with stomach cramps that bent her double. By Wednesday she was vomiting so violently that the bed sheets had to be changed 3 times. Thursday brought fever and delirium, her body wringing itself dry until her skin looked grey and papery. She died Friday morning, and the doctor who examined her body suspected cholera, though he couldn't be certain. The symptoms matched: violent gastric distress, dehydration, rapid decline. He wrote acute gastric fever on the death certificate and told the family to burn her bedding and wash everything she'd touched with lye soap. What the doctor didn't know was that Catherine Prescott had been drinking milk delivered to the house by Solomon 3 times in the week before she fell ill. Milk that had been sitting in a jar with crushed white snakeroot leaves steeping in it for 2 days, long enough for the toxins to infuse, but not long enough to change the taste significantly. The Prescott household didn't own a cow, so they relied on deliveries from various sources, and no one thought twice when Solomon showed up with a jar of fresh milk, explaining that the Devereux household had excess and Mrs. Marguerite wanted to share with neighbours. Catherine had drunk it gratefully, desperate for anything that might fill her stomach without her brother noticing how much she was consuming. 3 glasses over 5 days, and her body had absorbed enough trematol to destroy her digestive system from the inside out. But again, Solomon had predicted it. 2 weeks before Catherine fell ill, he'd been at the Prescott house delivering correspondence. He'd witnessed one of Daniel Prescott's tirades, watched the man berate his sister for the crime of existing in his house and costing him money. Solomon had been standing in the doorway, holding letters, completely invisible to both of them, the way enslaved people were always invisible when white folks fought. After Daniel had stormed out, Catherine had sat in the hallway crying silently, and Solomon had approached her with appropriate concern. "Are you well, ma'am?" She'd looked up at him with red eyes. "Do I have a choice?" And Solomon had said something then that she'd dismissed as the kind of fatalistic talk that came from people without power. "You have more choices than you think," he'd said quietly. "But they all end badly for someone like you, a woman with no husband, no money, dependent on a cruel man's charity. I'd say 2 weeks, maybe 3, before something breaks. Whether it's your spirit or your body, something's going to give way." Catherine had stared at him, unsettled by the specificity, by the way he'd said it like a diagnosis rather than sympathy. Then Solomon had bowed slightly and left, and she'd forgotten about the conversation until she was lying in bed, too weak to lift her head, remembering those words. Something's going to give way. She'd died thinking about that, wondering if the enslaved man who'd brought her milk had somehow known what was coming. The third death happened in July, and this one was different because everyone saw it coming but no one understood why. William Foster was a clerk at the Cotton Exchange, 42 years old, unmarried, and known around Mobile for 2 things: his meticulous record-keeping and his inability to stay sober past 6 in the evening. He drank at Turner's Tavern most nights, stumbling home along Water Street in the dark, somehow always making it back to his boarding house despite being barely able to walk straight. Except on July 16th, he didn't make it home. A night watchman found him floating face down in the bay the next morning, his pockets full of stones. Suicide, most people assumed. A drunk who'd finally decided to end it. The coroner agreed, noting the stones as evidence of intent, and William Foster was buried with minimal ceremony in a pauper's section of the cemetery. What no one knew was that William Foster had seen something he shouldn't have. He'd been working late at the cotton exchange 2 weeks before his death, processing paperwork, when he'd glanced out the window and seen Solomon leaving the Prescott warehouse carrying something. Nothing unusual about that. Enslaved people ran errands at all hours. But Foster had excellent vision and a clerk's attention to detail, and he'd noticed that Solomon had been inside the warehouse for 20 minutes, far longer than it took to deliver a message. He'd mentioned it the next day to Daniel Prescott in casual conversation. "Your boy was in the warehouse last night for quite a while. Everything all right?" Daniel had brushed it off, but Solomon had been in the office when Foster mentioned it, standing against the wall waiting for Daniel to finish a conversation, and he'd heard everything. Foster had seen his face change for just a fraction of a second, seen something calculating move behind those careful eyes. 2 days later, Solomon had been at Turner's Tavern delivering a message to another patron when William Foster had stumbled in for his evening drinks. Solomon had helped the tavern keeper carry Foster outside when he got too drunk, one arm around the clerk's shoulders, guiding him toward the docks with gentle suggestions. "Take the long way home, Mr. Foster. The water air will help clear your head." Foster had agreed, mumbling thanks, weaving toward the waterfront. He'd never made it past the second dock. The stones in his pockets hadn't been there when he'd left the tavern, but they'd been easy enough to add when a man was too drunk to notice hands reaching into his coat, filling the fabric with weight. Solomon had predicted this one too, though he'd been careful about how he'd phrased it. He'd mentioned to Marcus, the carriage driver, that Foster was living dangerously. "A man who drinks that much near water," Solomon had said, "won't last long. Eventually his luck runs out." Marcus had shrugged it off at the time, but when Foster's body was found, he'd remembered, and he'd started watching Solomon more carefully, noticing things he'd been too busy to notice before. The way Solomon volunteered for certain errands, the way he always seemed to know where people were and what they were doing, the way he collected plants and ground them late at night when he thought everyone else was asleep. Marcus didn't say anything yet. Suspicions weren't facts, and making accusations against another enslaved person was dangerous. It could fracture the fragile solidarity that kept them all alive. But the suspicion sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. The fourth death came in August, and this one felt cruel even by mobile standards. Mrs. Eleanor Talbot was 76 years old, a widow who lived 3 houses down from the Devereux family. She'd been kind in the way some old white women were kind to enslaved people, not kind enough to question the system, but kind enough to offer water on hot days and hand-me-down clothing at Christmas. She died in her sleep on August 23rd, and the doctor called it natural causes without even examining the body closely. A woman that age, dying peacefully in bed, was expected. Unremarkable. When Solomon heard the news, he'd nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "I told Rachel 2 weeks ago," he said quietly to Eliza, another enslaved woman in the Devereux household, Mrs. Talbot's heart was tired. You could see it in how she walked, how she got confused about simple things. Bodies give signals when they're shutting down. Eliza had felt her skin prickle. She'd been there when Solomon had made that prediction, had heard him tell Rachel that Mrs. Talbot wouldn't see September. At the time it had seemed like educated observation. Solomon knew medicine, after all. But now, with 3 other deaths behind them, all predicted with that same casual certainty, it felt different. It felt orchestrated. The problem was motive. Mrs. Talbot had been harmless, kind even. Why would Solomon want her dead? The answer, Eliza would learn later, was simple. Mrs. Talbot had been observant in ways that could become dangerous. She'd noticed Solomon collecting plants in the alley behind her house. She'd commented on it to her cook, mentioning that she'd seen the Devereux man gathering pokeweed and asking if that was normal. The cook had told Solomon about the conversation, thinking nothing of it, but Solomon had understood immediately. Observers were dangerous. People who noticed patterns, who remembered details, who might eventually connect pieces that shouldn't be connected. So Mrs. Talbot's evening tea, which Solomon had prepared once when her cook was ill, had contained a small amount of something derived from foxglove. Not enough to cause dramatic symptoms, just enough to put additional strain on a heart that was already old and tired. She'd felt short of breath that evening, had gone to bed early, and simply hadn't woken up. A natural death, expected, unmemorable. Except for the prediction that had come 2 weeks earlier, the prediction that kept adding to a pattern only a few people were starting to see. By the fall of 1847, the enslaved people in the Devereux household were having conversations they couldn't quite finish. Rachel would start to say something about Solomon's predictions, then stop herself, shaking her head. Eliza would mention the herbs, then change the subject when someone else entered the room. Marcus watched Solomon constantly now, noting every errand, every interaction, every time Solomon's hands touched something that later went into someone's mouth. But none of them spoke their suspicions aloud, because words made things real, and real things required action. And what action could they possibly take? Report their suspicions to Pierre Devereux? And say what? That they thought another enslaved person was murdering white people based on nothing but predictions and plant collecting? They'd be punished for making trouble, probably sold away or worse. The system they lived in didn't allow for the kind of truth-telling that their situation required. So they stayed silent and watched the body count rise. The 5th death came in October, and it struck at the heart of Mobile's business community. Henry Laurent was Pierre Devereux's business partner, 48 years old, healthy, robust, the kind of man who seemed built to live to 80. He died after a 3-day illness that the doctor called sudden respiratory failure, possibly a virulent strain of pneumonia. What made the death suspicious in retrospect was how quickly it had progressed. Monday, Laurent had been fine. Tuesday, he'd felt slightly ill. Wednesday, he could barely breathe. Thursday morning, he was dead. His personal servant, a man named Jacob, remembered that Laurent had complained about a bitter taste in his morning coffee twice during that final week. Bad beans, Laurent had said, grimacing. But he'd drunk it anyway, because he needed the energy for long workdays. Solomon had prepared that coffee both times. He'd been at Laurent's house delivering papers from Devereux's office, and Laurent had invited him into the study to wait while he reviewed documents. "Would you mind preparing coffee while I read these?" Laurent had asked, and Solomon had agreed with appropriate deference. What Laurent didn't see was the powder that went into the pot, something derived from aconite that dissolved quickly in hot liquid. Not enough to kill in a single dose, but enough to begin damaging Laurent's respiratory system, 2 doses over 4 days, and his lungs had filled with fluid that no doctor in 1847 could drain. He drowned on dry land, essentially, while everyone around him assumed it was just a particularly bad bout of pneumonia. Solomon had predicted this death too, of course. He'd mentioned to Pierre Devereux himself that Laurent looked poorly, that he might want to settle his business affairs soon. Devereux had dismissed it as Solomon being overly concerned, but when Laurent died, the comment came back with uncomfortable clarity. How had Solomon known? And why did it feel less like a warning and more like a promise? The wealthy families of Mobile were beginning to whisper among themselves now. "Have you noticed how many people have died this year?" More than usual, certainly. Cholera season hadn't even been that bad, but the death toll seemed higher somehow. They talked about it at church, at social gatherings, in quiet conversations over brandy. 8 people in 6 months. All seemingly natural deaths, but the concentration felt wrong. Mobile had always had deaths, yellow fever, accidents, the usual ailments, but this felt different. This felt targeted, though no one could articulate exactly why. Dr. Edmund Wickham was the first person outside the enslaved community to seriously consider that something wasn't right. Wickham was the physician who'd signed death certificates for 4 of Solomon's victims, and he'd begun reviewing his cases with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd missed something important. The pattern bothered him. Heart failure, gastric fever, drowning, natural causes, respiratory failure. All explainable individually, but together they formed a cluster that made his professional instincts itch. He started asking questions at social gatherings, casual inquiries about the deceased. Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Any common factors? One conversation changed everything. He was at the Chamberlain house for dinner 6 months after Thomas Chamberlain's death, and Abigail Chamberlain mentioned something that made Wickham's blood run cold. "The Devereux servant predicted my husband's death," she said lightly, as if it were an amusing oddity. "Told the cook his heart would give out within a week, and it did." Wickham set down his wine glass carefully. "Which servant?" "The one named Solomon. He knows medicine, apparently. Learned it from a Quaker in Charleston. He's remarkably perceptive about these things." "How many other deaths has he predicted?" Wickham asked. And Abigail had to think about it. "I'm not sure. I've heard others mention his predictions at gatherings. It's becoming rather well known. He has a gift for it." Wickham spent the next 2 weeks investigating quietly, talking to other families, asking about predictions, listening to stories that all pointed to the same source. Solomon had predicted at least 5 deaths, possibly more, all with disturbing accuracy, and Wickham realized something that made his hands shake when he wrote his notes. Every single person Solomon had predicted dying had died exactly when or how he'd predicted. That wasn't medical knowledge. That wasn't observation. That was something else entirely. But before Wickham could take his suspicions to the authorities, before he could build a case that would hold up in court, something happened that made him understand exactly how dangerous his investigation had become. Solomon approached him after a church service in early November, moving with that careful deference enslaved people used around white men of status. "Dr. Wickham, sir," Solomon had said quietly, "I've been meaning to tell you. You don't look well." Wickham had frozen. "What do you mean?" "Your color's off, sir, and the way you're breathing, shallow and quick. I've seen that before in men who drink as much as you do. The liver and kidneys start failing, and the body can't process toxins properly. I'd say you have maybe 6 weeks, 2 months at most, before something gives way. You might want to settle your affairs." Wickham had stared at Solomon, seeing something in those steady eyes that made his stomach drop. This wasn't a diagnosis. This was a threat. Solomon had smiled then, a small, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just trying to be helpful, sir. I'd hate to see something happen to you." And then he'd walked away, leaving Wickham standing outside the church with the taste of fear in his mouth. Because the message had been clear. Stop investigating or join the list. Stop asking questions or become the next prediction that comes true. Dr. Edmund Wickham died on November 29th, 1847, and his death was everything Solomon had promised it would be. It started with dizziness on a Monday morning, the kind of vertigo that made the room spin even when standing still. By Tuesday, Wickham was vomiting so violently that he couldn't keep water down, his body convulsing with each attempt. Wednesday brought pain that felt like his organs were being squeezed in a vice, radiating from his abdomen through his entire torso. Thursday, his urine turned dark and stopped coming altogether, his kidneys shutting down like doors closing one by one. He died Friday afternoon, conscious until the very end, aware enough to understand that Solomon had been right about the timeline. 6 weeks, almost to the day. The physician who examined Wickham's body, a doctor brought in from Montgomery because all of Mobile's other physicians were either too drunk or too frightened to handle the case, noted acute renal failure with possible arsenic poisoning in his preliminary report. But he couldn't prove the poisoning definitively. The tests available in 1847 were crude, unreliable, and Wickham had been a heavy drinker for years. His organs could have failed naturally, could have. Those 2 words haunted everyone who'd known about Wickham's investigation, because there was another possibility, one that was far more terrifying. Solomon had known Wickham was investigating him, had delivered a public threat disguised as medical observation, and had followed through with methodical precision. 3 days before Wickham fell ill, Solomon had been at the doctor's office, delivering a message from Pierre Devereux about a medical consultation. Wickham had offered him water while he waited, pointing to a pitcher that sat on the side table. Solomon had poured himself a glass, had waited until Wickham was distracted with paperwork, and had added something to the pitcher. Something colorless, odorless, that would accumulate in the body over multiple exposures. Wickham had drunk from that pitcher 3 times over the next 2 days, never suspecting that each glass was adding to a lethal dose building in his system. When the symptoms started, Wickham had known immediately what was happening. He'd tried to tell people, had gasped out warnings to his wife, to the Montgomery physician, but his words came out slurred and desperate, the ravings of a dying man in delirium. Solomon, he'd gasped. The Devereaux slave, poisoner, check Solomon, but no one had taken him seriously enough to act on it immediately. By the time Wickham was buried, the death toll had reached 6, and Mobile's wealthy families were beginning to feel something they hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not the distant fear of yellow fever that might come with summer, or the abstract fear of financial ruin, but immediate, personal fear that someone in their homes, someone they trusted with their food and medicine and intimate daily needs, might be planning their murders. Pierre Devereaux finally went to Sheriff James Cartwright 3 days after Wickham's funeral. He brought with him a list of deaths, predictions, and a timeline that showed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. 6 people dead, Devereaux said, spreading papers across the sheriff's desk. All predicted by my servant Solomon, some of them weeks before they died. Dr. Wickham suspected him, started investigating, and now Wickham's dead too, exactly when Solomon predicted. Cartwright was a practical man who'd spent 20 years as sheriff learning that most things that looked like conspiracies were actually just bad luck and timing. But even he couldn't dismiss the pattern Devereaux was showing him. 6 people, 6 predictions, 6 deaths that matched the predictions down to the week and sometimes the day. "What do you want me to do?" Cartwright asked. "Arrest him? On what charge? Making accurate medical observations? You need proof. Real evidence, not just a pattern that might be coincidence." "It's not coincidence," Devereaux insisted, and there was genuine fear in his voice now. "I think he was planning to kill me and my wife next. I found a note in his quarters. Just initials and the word pending. Our initials. PD and MD. Pending." That got Cartwright's attention. He agreed to watch Solomon, to document everything, to look for evidence that would hold up in court. But watching Solomon proved difficult because the man seemed to know he was being observed, and he moved through his days with the same careful efficiency as always, giving them nothing. He collected no plants. He made no suspicious preparations. He served meals with perfect deference and completed his errands without deviation. For 3 weeks, Solomon was the model of what white families wanted enslaved people to be: invisible, obedient, harmless. But during those 3 weeks, 2 more people died, and both deaths had been predicted with Solomon's characteristic precision. The 7th death was a child, and it broke something in how people viewed Solomon's actions. Sarah Whitfield was 8 years old, small for her age, with lungs that had never worked quite right since a bout of pneumonia when she was 4. She caught every illness that passed through Mobile, and her mother, Amelia, had spent 8 years in a state of constant vigilance, watching her daughter for signs of sickness. Sarah died on December 18, 1847, after a week of fever and struggling breath. The doctor called it pneumonia, expected given the child's medical history. A tragedy, but not a surprise. Except that Solomon had predicted it 2 months earlier, mentioning to Marguerite Devereaux that the Whitfield girl wouldn't see Christmas. "She's got a weakness in her lungs that's getting worse," he'd said. "Next illness that comes through will take her. Her body's giving up the fight." When Sarah died exactly as predicted, Amelia Whitfield had a breakdown that required sedation. But her husband, James, had a different reaction. He went to Pierre Devereaux and demanded to know everything about Solomon, every detail of his history, every prediction he'd made. And when James learned about the pattern, about the 6 previous deaths, about Dr. Wickham's investigation, he did something that would finally break the case open. He demanded an autopsy of his daughter's body. The Montgomery physician performed it reluctantly, not wanting to disturb a child's corpse, but what he found made him call for Sheriff Cartwright immediately. Sarah Whitfield's lungs weren't just infected, they showed signs of chemical irritation consistent with inhalation of toxic substances. Not enough to kill a healthy child, but more than enough to destroy lungs that were already compromised. What had Sarah been breathing? The physician couldn't say for certain, but he noted that her bedroom had been recently treated for mold by a servant sent from the Devereaux household. A servant who'd burned something in the room to clean the air, who'd assured the family it was just sage and herbs. Solomon had been in Sarah Whitfield's room for 30 minutes, burning dried oleander leaves mixed with other plants, creating smoke that Sarah had breathed while sleeping. Over the course of 5 nights, her lungs had absorbed enough toxins to ensure that when the next illness came, her body wouldn't be able to fight it. Murder disguised as housekeeping. Systematic, calculated, and completely invisible until someone thought to look. The 8th death came in January 1848, and it finally gave authorities the evidence they needed. Robert Brennan was a cotton broker, 53 years old, known throughout Mobile for his violent temper and his vicious treatment of enslaved people. He'd killed at least 2 of his own slaves in fits of rage, facing no consequences because killing your own property wasn't murder in Alabama's legal system. He died on January 22nd after attending a business dinner, collapsing in the street on his way home. The initial assumption was stroke, given his age and temperament. Men with that much anger in them often dropped dead suddenly. But when the body was examined more carefully, the physician found something unusual. Brennan's lips and fingernails had a faint bluish tint, and his blood was darker than it should have been, almost cherry red in color. The Montgomery physician, who was becoming something of an expert in suspicious deaths, recognized the signs immediately. Cyanide poisoning. Not the dramatic immediate kind from large doses, but slow accumulation from smaller amounts over time. He traced Brennan's final hours and discovered that he'd drunk brandy at the business dinner, brandy poured from a decanter that had been delivered to the host's house that afternoon as a gift. The host, a merchant named Patterson, had received it with a note saying it was from Pierre Devereaux, as thanks for a recent business favor, except Pierre Devereaux had sent no such gift. The decanter had been delivered by Solomon, who'd explained that his master wanted to show appreciation. Patterson had accepted it without question, had served it at dinner, and Brennan had drunk 3 glasses of brandy laced with cyanide compounds extracted from crushed cherry pits that Solomon had been accumulating for months. Solomon had predicted Brennan's death 6 weeks earlier, telling Marcus that a man with that much rage and cruelty wouldn't last long. "His anger's going to kill him," Solomon had said. "Whether it's his heart or something else, a man like that is living on borrowed time." When Brennan died exactly as predicted and the cyanide poisoning was confirmed, Sheriff Cartwright had enough. He obtained a warrant to search Solomon's quarters, and what they found there on January 28, 1848, was evidence so comprehensive it suggested Solomon had been planning this for years, not months. Hidden under the floorboards beneath Solomon's bed, 17 jars of dried plants, carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Aconite, white snaker root, oleander, foxglove, hemlock, pokeweed, death camas. Packets of powdered substances wrapped in oiled paper, small bottles of tinctures with dates written on them. And most damning of all, a leather-bound ledger with entries that spanned 4 years. The ledger was extraordinary. It showed a level of planning and documentation that made even hardened lawmen feel sick as they read it. The first section contained observations written in meticulous detail. Subject profiles. Solomon had titled them, though the subjects were human beings whose lives he'd been studying like a scientist examining specimens. TC reads one entry from 1844. Age 52, overweight, drinks heavily, climbs stairs with difficulty. Heart shows signs of strained neck vein distension, finger swelling, shortness of breath, probability of natural failure within 2 to 3 years. Acceleration possible through cardiac glycosides. The entries went on for pages. Every person Solomon had killed was there, along with at least a dozen others he'd been studying but hadn't targeted yet. He'd noted their habits, their health conditions, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. He'd calculated how to make each death look natural. He'd estimated timelines, and he'd recorded the outcomes with clinical precision. The second section of the ledger contained methods, detailed notes on plant preparations, extraction processes, dosage calculations, delivery mechanisms. Foxglove cardiac glycosides effective in alcohol accumulate over multiple doses, 15-20 milligrams pure extract, sufficient for subject TC given existing cardiac strain. White snake root trematol toxin, dairy-soluble, causes gastric distress identical to cholera. 500 milligrams over 5 days sufficient for subject CP given malnourished state. This wasn't amateur poisoning. This was sophisticated chemical knowledge applied with scientific precision. Solomon had turned medicine into murder, and he'd done it so skillfully that 8 people had died before anyone understood what was happening. The third section was the most disturbing because it showed predictions written weeks or months before the deaths occurred, with spaces left for actual death dates to be filled in later. Every single prediction had come true. Every space had been filled. And at the bottom of the page, 2 final entries made Pierre Devereaux's hands shake as he read them. PD pending, method selected, awaiting optimal conditions. MD pending, method selected, awaiting optimal conditions. Pierre and Marguerite Devereaux. Solomon had been planning their murders, had already selected his methods, and was simply waiting for the right moment. The search of the Devereaux house that followed was frantic. They tore through kitchen supplies, medicine cabinets, wine cellars, tea canisters, sugar bowls, anywhere Solomon might have placed poison. They found nothing definitive, but the absence of evidence wasn't reassuring. It meant Solomon had either been bluffing, which seemed unlikely given his track record, or he'd hidden the poison so cleverly that they'd never find it until it was too late. Pierre Devereaux refused to eat or drink anything from his house for a month. He moved his family to a hotel and hired food tasters, living in a state of paranoia that would never fully leave him. Because Solomon had achieved something remarkable in its cruelty. He'd proven that even in death, even in custody, he could make his former owners feel unsafe in their own homes. Solomon was arrested without resistance on January 28, 1848. Sheriff Cartwright and 3 deputies came to the Devereaux house at sunset, expecting struggle, perhaps violence. Instead, they found Solomon sitting on his bed in the servants' quarters, fully dressed, hands folded in his lap, as if he'd been waiting for them. He didn't fight when they shackled him, didn't protest his innocence, didn't show any emotion at all as they led him through the streets to the jailhouse. The only thing he said during the entire arrest was a question directed at Pierre Devereaux, who'd insisted on being present. "Did you find it? The poison you think I placed in your house?" Devereaux had stared at him, unable to answer, and Solomon had smiled. "That's what I thought. You'll spend the rest of your lives looking. Every time you eat, every time you drink, you'll wonder if this is it. If this is the moment when whatever I left behind finally takes effect. That's worse than dying, isn't it? The uncertainty, the fear. I think I prefer it this way." They dragged him away, still smiling, and Devereaux had gone home and vomited until his stomach was empty, because Solomon was right. The not knowing was worse than death, and he'd found a way to inflict that terror even from inside a jail cell. The news of Solomon's arrest spread through mobile like wildfire. Within hours, every wealthy family in the city was questioning their enslaved servants, searching their quarters, looking for evidence that they too might be harboring a poisoner. The panic was extraordinary. Some families sold their enslaved people immediately, preferring financial loss to living with the fear. Others implemented draconian security measures, locking up anything that could be used to prepare poison, posting guards, hiring tasters. The social fabric of Mobile's slaveholding class began to unravel as they realized that the system they'd built, one that required trusting enslaved people with intimate access to their daily lives, contained a vulnerability they'd never imagined. In the enslaved community, reactions were complex and divided. Some were horrified by what Solomon had done, recognizing that his actions would bring collective punishment down on all of them. Already restrictions were tightening, movement was being limited, suspicion was replacing the minimal trust that had existed before. But others felt something different. Not approval exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction that someone had found a way to fight back, had found a crack in the system and exploited it with devastating effectiveness. They didn't talk about this openly, couldn't, but in quiet conversations in quarters and at market stalls, you could hear it. The white folks are scared now. They're scared of us. And maybe they should be. The trial was scheduled for March 1848, and Mobile's courthouse prepared for what would be the most sensational case in the city's history. But before the trial could begin, something happened that changed everything. 4 more people died between Solomon's arrest and his trial date, and every single one had been predicted in Solomon's ledger. Deaths he'd set in motion before his arrest, poisons he'd already administered, plans he'd already executed. The authorities realized with growing horror that Solomon had been planning multiple murders simultaneously, staggering them so that even after his arrest, his work would continue. The man in the jail cell hadn't just killed 8 people. He'd killed at least 12, possibly 13, and some of his victims had still been walking around alive when he was arrested, not knowing they were already dead, just waiting for the poison in their systems to finish its work. The 9th death happened on February 3rd, 1848, 6 days after Solomon's arrest, and it proved that even from behind bars, his work continued. Judge Marcus Finley, who presided over Mobile's circuit court, collapsed in his study after complaining of chest pains for several days. He was 61 years old, and his death was attributed to heart disease until the Montgomery physician examined the body and found the same telltale signs he was learning to recognize. Foxglove poisoning, administered over an extended period. When they checked Solomon's ledger, they found Finley's entry. MF cardiac glycosides in evening port, dosage calculated for 8 to 10-week progression. Death expected late January, early February. Solomon had been poisoning Judge Finley for 2 months before his arrest, small amounts added to the port wine that Finley drank every evening as a digestive aid. The judge had purchased the wine from his usual supplier, never knowing that Solomon had gained access to the shipment during delivery and had injected the bottles with his preparation. By the time Solomon was arrested, Finley had absorbed enough toxins that his death was inevitable. The poison was already working, the damage already done. Finley died on schedule, exactly when Solomon's ledger predicted, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save him, even if they'd known. The 10th death came on February 19th. Margaret Ashford, a wealthy widow who lived alone with 6 enslaved servants, died in her sleep. Natural causes, the initial report said. She was 72, and old people died. Except that Solomon's ledger had an entry for her. M.A. observant, asks too many questions about plant collecting, risk assessment high, elimination necessary, method. Belladonna extract in evening tea, long-term administration, death expected mid-February. They found traces of belladonna in her medicine cabinet in a tincture labeled for eye drops that Solomon had prepared 6 months earlier when Margaret had complained of vision problems. She'd been using it regularly, absorbing small amounts of poison with each application, never knowing that the servant who'd prepared her medicine had also prepared her death. The 11th death was Peter Whitmore, a lawyer who'd been helping Pierre Devereaux with business contracts. He died on March 2nd, the day before Solomon's trial was scheduled to begin. Acute poisoning, the physician ruled, though he couldn't identify the specific toxin. Solomon's ledger was clearer. PW access during contract negotiations, single-dose administration planned for late February, aconite in brandy, death expected within 48 hours. Whitmore had shared drinks with Solomon during a meeting at the Devereux house 3 days before Solomon's arrest. 1 drink, 1 dose. Carefully calculated to take effect weeks later, giving Solomon time to establish an alibi and making the death seem unconnected to his arrest. By the time the trial began on March 15, 1848, the death toll had reached 11 confirmed murders with strong evidence, and at least 2 more suspected cases that couldn't be proven definitively. Mobile's courthouse was packed with people who'd come to see the man who'd terrorized their city for 4 years. The gallery, filled with wealthy families who'd lost relatives, curious onlookers fascinated by the sensational case, and enslaved people who watched silently from the segregated section, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes sharp, taking in everything. The prosecution was led by Wallace Breenidge, a stern prosecutor who'd built his reputation on death penalty cases. His strategy was simple: let the evidence speak for itself. He presented the ledger, the plant collection, the testimonies from the enslaved people in the Devereux household, the autopsy reports, the pattern of predictions that had all come true. He brought in Rachel, who testified about the herbs she'd seen Solomon collecting. Marcus described the bitter almond smell on Solomon's hands. Eliza recounted the predictions and how they'd made her feel like she was watching death being scheduled. Jacob, Henry Laurent's former servant, testified that Solomon had prepared Laurent's coffee and that Laurent had complained of bitter taste afterward. The defense attorney, a young lawyer named Philip Hastings appointed by the court, tried to argue circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt, but his heart wasn't in it. How do you defend someone who'd kept a murder diary? How do you create reasonable doubt when the defendant had documented everything in his own handwriting? Hastings did what he could, suggesting that the ledger might be medical notes rather than murder plans, that the predictions could be explained by medical knowledge, that correlation wasn't causation. But even he seemed to know it was futile. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was undeniable. Solomon had killed at least 11 people, possibly more, and he'd done it with such precision that it looked like natural causes until you saw the whole picture. On the trial's 3rd day, something unprecedented happened. Solomon asked to testify. His attorney tried to stop him, understanding that anything Solomon said would only strengthen the prosecution's case, but Solomon insisted he had the right to speak, and he intended to use it. When he took the stand, the courtroom went silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The chance to hear directly from the man who'd outsmarted an entire city, to understand how he'd done it and why. Wallace Breenidge approached with the ledger in hand. "Did you write this?" "Yes," Solomon said calmly, his voice educated and clear, shocking those who'd expected broken English and deference. "And these entries," Breenidge continued, reading from the book, T.C. Foxglove in evening whiskey, C.P. white snakeroot in milk, R.P. aconite in wine. What do they mean? Solomon looked directly at the jury, and when he spoke, his words were delivered with such matter-of-fact calm that they were somehow more disturbing than rage would have been. They mean exactly what you think they mean. I studied each person. I learned their vulnerabilities. I selected methods that would make their deaths appear natural. And I executed my plans with the precision you'd expect from someone who'd been educated in medicine and given 4 years to perfect his approach. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harrison hammered his gavel for order. When silence returned, Breenidge asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why? Why did you do this? Solomon's answer would be quoted in newspapers across the South and debated in legal journals for decades afterward. Because I could, he said simply. Because you gave me the knowledge, the access, and the trust necessary to do it, and you never once considered that I might use those gifts against you. You educated me in medicine so I could be more useful, never thinking that the same knowledge that heals can also kill. You gave me access to your homes, your food, your intimate daily needs because you believed I was property, something less than human, something incapable of complex thought or long-term planning. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the white faces in the courtroom. I was invisible to you. I moved through your houses like furniture, and you talked about your secrets, your sins, your cruelties, as if I couldn't hear or wouldn't remember. That was your mistake. Every single person in this courtroom has said or done something in front of an enslaved person that they'd never say in front of their equals. You forget we're watching, always watching, learning, remembering. So this was revenge? Breenidge demanded. No, Solomon said, and his voice carried no heat, no anger, just cold rationality. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is killing someone who wronged you personally. This was something else. This was systematic elimination of people who made the world worse by existing in it, combined with removal of threats to my security, and in some cases simply demonstrating that I could. He gestured to the ledger. Thomas Chamberlain worked field slaves to death and laughed about it. Catherine Prescott was abused by her brother for years, and no one helped her. Robert Brennan killed at least 2 of his own slaves in fits of rage and faced no consequences. Judge Finlay sent poor men to the gallows for stealing bread while letting wealthy criminals walk free. Dr. Wickham was getting too close to discovering what I was doing, so he had to go. Each death had a reason, even if you don't agree with my reasoning. But what about the others? Breenidge pressed. William Foster, Eleanor Talbot, Sarah Whitfield. For the first time, Solomon's expression shifted, something almost like regret crossing his face. Foster saw me where I shouldn't have been. He was observant, detail-oriented, and he would have eventually connected patterns. Mrs. Talbot was similar. Kind woman, but too curious about my plant collecting. She was beginning to ask questions that could have led to exposure. And the child. Solomon paused, and the courtroom held its breath. That was an error, a miscalculation I regret. The dose was intended for her father, who owed money to Pierre Devereaux and was planning to flee without paying. I'd prepared a treatment for the child's breathing problems that her mother asked me to make. The dosage was calculated for an adult's consumption if the father had taken the medicine instead. The child used it directly. That death was unintended. The courtroom exploded. People shouted. Amelia Whitfield screamed accusations from the gallery, her husband barely able to restrain her. Judge Harrison hammered his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the courtroom. When order was finally restored, Breenidge moved to his final questions. The Devereaux family, your owners, did you actually poison them, or were those ledger entries merely planning? Solomon's smile returned, and it was the most unsettling thing anyone in that courtroom would ever see. Does it matter? He asked quietly. Whether I actually placed poison in their house or simply made them believe I did, the result is the same. Pierre and Marguerite Devereaux will spend the rest of their lives in fear. Every meal, every drink, every minor illness will make them wonder if this is it. If something I prepared years ago is finally taking effect, they'll hire tasters and guards. They'll avoid their own home. They'll live in constant anxiety until the day they die, whether that's tomorrow or 30 years from now. That's a kind of death, too. Slower, but perhaps more effective. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in that courtroom understood what Solomon had just revealed. He hadn't just killed people's bodies. He'd killed their sense of security, their ability to trust, their peace of mind. And he'd done it so effectively that even executing him wouldn't undo the damage. Breenidge had no more questions. The confession was complete, damning beyond anything he could have hoped for. The defense declined to cross-examine, recognizing that anything they asked would only make things worse. Solomon was allowed to make a final statement before stepping down. "I know what you're going to do," Solomon said, addressing the courtroom at large. "You're going to convict me and hang me, and you'll feel like justice has been served. But I want you to understand something. I'm not unique. I'm not some aberration, some monster that appeared from nowhere. I'm what your system creates. You built a society where human beings are property, where you own people's bodies, but think you also own their minds. You give us knowledge because it makes us more useful, and then you're shocked when we use that knowledge for our own purposes. You trust us with your food, your medicine, your children, your most intimate moments, and then you're surprised when one of us realizes what that access makes possible. He paused, letting his words sink in. You'll have others like me. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but they'll come. Because you can't own someone's mind, no matter how many chains you use. You can beat people, starve them, sell them, work them to death, but you can't stop them from thinking, from planning, from watching and learning and waiting for opportunities. I'm proof that the system you've built has a fundamental flaw. You've created a class of people who have every reason to hate you, who live in your homes, who handle everything you consume, and who you've trained to be invisible. What did you think would happen? The jury deliberated for 47 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Solomon showed no reaction. Judge Harrison sentenced him to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. Solomon was led back to his cell, and Mobile's wealthy families went home to implement even more stringent security measures, knowing that Solomon's words would haunt them far longer than his crimes already had. The days between sentencing and execution were marked by frantic investigations. Authorities searched for the 12th and 13th deaths that Solomon had allegedly predicted. They found 2 additional suspicious deaths that occurred after Solomon's arrest, bringing the total to 13. The 12th death was discovered when they re-examined the case of Thomas Bradford, a merchant who died of apparent food poisoning in late February. His symptoms matched arsenic poisoning, and when they searched his business records, they found that Solomon had delivered documents to his office the week before his death. Bradford had offered Solomon tea during the visit. The 13th death was even more disturbing because it happened after the trial. Elizabeth Chambers, wife of a cotton mill owner, fell ill in late March with symptoms that doctors couldn't identify: progressive weakness, organ failure, mysterious bleeding. She died on April 2nd, and the autopsy revealed evidence of slow-acting plant toxins that had accumulated in her system over months. When they checked Solomon's ledger one final time, they found an entry they'd missed: EC pending, long-term administration already in progress, death expected April, method, cumulative toxin, untraceable without extensive analysis. Solomon had poisoned Elizabeth Chambers months before his arrest, timing the dose so carefully that she wouldn't show symptoms until long after he was in custody. It was his final demonstration of control, his final proof that even caught, even convicted, even awaiting execution, he could still reach out from his jail cell and touch the lives of Mobile's elite with death. The execution was scheduled for July 28, 1851. 3 years after Solomon's arrest, after appeals had been exhausted and legal maneuvering had run its course. The delay was unusual, but authorities had kept Solomon alive, hoping he'd reveal where he'd hidden additional poisons, hoping he'd provide information that might save lives. He never did. He spent 3 years in a cell, refusing visitors, refusing clergy, spending his time reading medical texts that guards brought him, as if he was still studying, still learning, still planning things no one would ever discover. The morning of the execution, 300 people gathered in the courthouse courtyard. The wealthy families who'd lost relatives stood near the front. Amelia Whitfield was there, her face hard as stone, still mourning the daughter who'd been killed by mistake. Pierre and Marguerite Devereux attended, though both looked 20 years older than they had 4 years earlier, worn down by constant fear and paranoia. The enslaved community watched from the segregated section, their presence mandatory, meant to serve as a warning about what happened to those who defied the social order. Solomon was led to the gallows at dawn. He'd refused a hood, insisting on facing the crowd with open eyes. When asked if he had final words, he looked out at the assembled faces and delivered the statement that would define his legacy. "You built a system that treats people as property," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "and you're surprised when property fights back. You gave us knowledge to make us more useful, and you're shocked when we use it for our own purposes. You trusted us with your lives, and you're horrified to discover that trust was misplaced. I'm not asking for mercy. I don't want your forgiveness. I want you to understand that I'm not the last. You'll have others. Maybe not poisoners specifically, but people who find the cracks in your system and exploit them. People who realize that being underestimated is a kind of power. People who understand that invisibility is the perfect weapon." He smiled then, that same unsettling smile that had haunted people throughout his trial. "And for those of you who think executing me ends this, I have one final gift. Everything I prepared, everything I put in motion, hasn't finished yet. Some of you in this crowd right now have already been exposed to things you don't know about, things that take years to work, things that won't show symptoms until it's far too late to treat. You'll never know if you're one of them. You'll spend the rest of your lives wondering. Every illness, every pain, every strange symptom will make you think of me. And that's better than any revenge I could have planned." The trapdoor opened before anyone could respond to this final revelation, and Solomon dropped. The witnesses said his neck broke cleanly, death was instantaneous. But his final words hung in the air like poison itself, infecting everyone who heard them with doubt that would never fully dissipate. Because he was right. They would never know if he was telling the truth or simply inflicting one last psychological wound, and that uncertainty was worse than any physical threat could have been. The aftermath of Solomon's execution rippled through Mobile for decades. Pierre and Marguerite Devereaux never returned to normal life. They sold their house within 2 years and moved to Richmond, Virginia, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for them in Mobile. Pierre died in 1854 of a mysterious wasting illness that no doctor could diagnose. Marguerite lived until 1869, but she spent those years as a near recluse, terrified of food, of water, of anything that might have been touched by poison years earlier. Whether Solomon had actually prepared their deaths or simply broken them psychologically, the result was the same. He'd destroyed their lives without touching them. The other wealthy families of Mobile implemented security measures that fundamentally changed how they interacted with enslaved people. Some stopped allowing enslaved people anywhere near food preparation. Others went the opposite direction, arguing that better treatment would prevent resentment from building to murderous levels. Neither approach addressed the fundamental injustice that had created Solomon's rage in the first place. The system continued, people continued to be enslaved, and the horror of what Solomon had done became a cautionary tale told in different ways depending on who was telling it. In the enslaved community, Solomon's story spread like wildfire throughout the South, told in whispers and in coded language, always with the understanding that speaking too freely could be dangerous. Some saw him as a monster who'd killed indiscriminately and brought collective punishment down on everyone. Others saw him differently, not as a hero exactly, but as proof that the system had vulnerabilities, that the people who built it weren't as untouchable as they believed. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing. Solomon had been brilliant, patient, and terrifying, and he demonstrated that knowledge was power regardless of who possessed it. The medical community studied Solomon's methods with morbid fascination. Dr. Robert Marsh, who replaced Dr. Wickham as Mobile's primary physician, published papers about plant-based poisons and the difficulty of detecting them in corpses. The work was controversial. Some doctors accused him of providing a blueprint for poisoners, but it improved toxicology practices and prompted better documentation of suspicious deaths. Solomon's ledger was preserved as a legal document, and medical students studied it to understand how botanical knowledge could be weaponized. His case became a teaching example of why doctors needed to be vigilant, why they couldn't assume that natural-seeming deaths were actually natural. The courthouse where Solomon was tried still stands in Mobile today, converted into a museum that chronicles the city's history. The ledger is displayed behind glass, its pages yellowed but still legible, and visitors who read it describe feeling deeply unsettled. Not by gore or violence, there's none of that in Solomon's careful handwriting, but by the clinical precision, the methodical planning, the complete absence of remorse. It's a reminder that intelligence and education can serve any purpose, that knowledge is neutral and can be used for healing or harm depending on the person who possesses it. Modern historians who've studied the case note several disturbing elements that continue to resonate. First, Solomon was almost certainly telling the truth about his victims' crimes and cruelty. Court records and personal papers confirm that most of the people he killed had documented histories of violence, corruption, or abuse. He wasn't selecting victims randomly. He was targeting people who, in his view, deserved what they got. Second, his body count of 13 confirmed murders might be conservative. Several other suspicious deaths occurred in Mobile and Charleston during the periods when Solomon lived in those cities, deaths that were never connected to him, but that show patterns consistent with his methods. Some researchers believe he may have been responsible for as many as 20 murders over a decade, perfecting his techniques long before he arrived in Mobile. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, the question of whether he actually poisoned the Devereux family remains unanswered. Pierre died in 1854 of symptoms consistent with slow-acting poisoning. Marguerite's lifelong ailments could have been psychosomatic, caused by fear and stress, or they could have been the result of something Solomon had prepared years earlier, something designed to work so slowly that it would be impossible to trace. The uncertainty was intentional, Solomon's final demonstration of power that extended beyond his grave. If you've made it this far in this story, you've just experienced what historians call one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Not because of supernatural horror, but because every element was terrifyingly human. Solomon wasn't possessed by demons. He wasn't mentally ill in any clinical sense. He was intelligent, patient, calculating, and he used the system that oppressed him as a weapon against those who built it. The real horror of his story isn't the murders themselves, it's how easily he operated, how perfectly he understood the blind spots in the society around him, and how he exploited trust and underestimation with devastating effectiveness. The story raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. Was Solomon a murderer who deserved execution, or a victim who became a monster through the brutality of slavery? Can you condemn his methods while understanding his rage? Is there a moral difference between killing individuals who were themselves killers and participating in a system that killed thousands through legal means? These questions haunted people in 1851, and they're still relevant today. Because Solomon's story is ultimately about power, who has it, how it's maintained, and what happens when someone without official power finds ways to exercise it anyway. The sealed room of history contains stories like Solomon's, stories that challenge sanitized narratives and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of oppression create the conditions for unimaginable acts. And if you're interested in more stories like this, stories that dig into the darkest corners of American history and refuse to look away, this is exactly what we do here. Every week, we unseal another room, another buried story, another truth that someone tried to hide. The history they don't teach in schools because it's too disturbing, too morally complex, too challenging to comfortable narratives. What makes Solomon's case particularly relevant isn't just the historical horror. It's what it reveals about human nature, about systems of control, about the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. He demonstrated that education is dangerous to those who want to maintain power through force. That trust, given to people you consider inferior, is a vulnerability. That intelligence and capability don't correlate with social status, that the people society treats as invisible are often watching more carefully than anyone realizes. These lessons made Mobile's wealthy families terrified in 1851, and they should probably make us uncomfortable today because the fundamental dynamics Solomon exploited still exist in different forms. The final mystery, the one that probably haunted Mobile's elite until they died, was whether Solomon had been telling the truth in his final statement. Had he really prepared additional deaths that would take years to manifest? Or was that final claim just psychological warfare, a last twist of the knife designed to ensure that everyone who heard it would spend the rest of their lives in fear? We'll never know. And that's exactly the point. That's the genius of Solomon's final move. By making the threat vague and long-term, by suggesting that exposure had already occurred but wouldn't show symptoms for years, he ensured that every illness, every unexplained death, every strange symptom would carry his shadow. He became immortal through fear, his presence lingering long after his body was buried in an unmarked grave. So, what do you think? Do you believe Solomon was justified in his actions, or was he simply a murderer using oppression as an excuse? Could there have been more victims we never discovered? People who died years after his execution from things he'd prepared long before? And the most disturbing question of all, if you'd been in Solomon's position, educated enough to see opportunities, angry enough to want revenge, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment, would you have made different choices? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these questions don't have easy answers, and hearing different perspectives is how we make sense of history's darkest chapters. If this story kept you hooked, if you felt that cold understanding of how someone could turn knowledge into murder, then you need to subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unseal another buried story from America's past. Share this with someone who loves dark history, someone who isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths about where we came from and what that means for where we're going. And most importantly, keep questioning, keep digging, keep refusing to accept sanitized versions of history that make us feel better by leaving out the parts that make us think. Because stories like Solomon's exist in every hidden corner of the past, waiting for someone to bring them into the light. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next room we unseal.